Subscriptions. Daryl Cooper, the historical reinterpreter who's now been interviewed by both Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan, once tweeted the following. I hesitate to argue with a bad, now deleted meme. Still, Cooper's comparison is worth highlighting for what it reveals about a certain reptile-brained political tendency. This tendency is best captured by the French revolutionary slogan, "No enemies to the left," which can be updated to "No enemies to the right" in the present example. Obviously, or maybe it only used to be obvious, it's possible to be both anti-Nazi and anti-woke. It's also possible to have a sense of proper perspective. For example, you can think that the drag queen Last Supper at the 2024 Paris Olympics was cringeworthy, but that the Nazi occupation of France was worse in virtually every way. To think otherwise requires rewriting history to denazify the Nazis. Thus Cooper's claims that Hitler was dragged into World War II and that Churchill was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did. Or that rather than acting with genocidal intent, the Nazis launched a war where they were completely unprepared, so they just threw these people into camps. And millions of people ended up dead there. This falsification of the past is intended to create an ideological narrative about the present. Namely, per Cooper, that the post-World War II order is really defined by the fact that, after Nuremberg, it really became effectively illegal in the West to be, genuinely right-wing. Like the things we call right-wing. If the Nazis were actually not so bad, then the current global order is founded on a lie. And so if we rehabilitate the Nazis, we can be genuinely right-wing again. We will then no longer have to endure drag queen story hour, or, presumably, the existence of Poland and Einstein's theory of relativity. The Nazis are not your coalition partners. Yet as I've previously written, the Nazis themselves were not genuinely right-wing, but more akin to a millenarian death cult. They rejected what Hitler called the narrow limits of modern nationalism in favor of a racially based empire. They planned to eliminate Christianity, which Hitler called a rebellion against natural law upon victory. They were not even, strictly speaking, white supremacists, but rather Nordic supremacists. Generalplan Ost outlined the 25-year Nazi plan to enslave, deport, and murder millions of white, subhuman Slavs after conquering Eastern Europe. So much for Cooper's theory that the Nazis just stumbled into war and improvised. At the most basic level, Hitler was not out to conserve, but to destroy. He was as much a revolutionary as Lenin, but for the cause of an Aryan rather than a proletarian utopia. Cooper claims that Hitler's antisemitism is what allowed him to love the German people. But as a social Darwinist, Hitler viewed the bulk of German people with contempt, and himself as nothing but a magnet constantly moving across the German nation and extracting the steel from this people. In the end, he even called for the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, since the future belongs entirely to the strong people of the East. By contrast, in 1944, George Orwell wrote that it is significant that in the moment of disaster the man best able to unite the nation was Churchill, a conservative of aristocratic origins. As actual historian John Lukács notes, it is also significant that Orwell gave the name Winston Smith to his hero in 1984, and that in his first act of revolt against darkness and oppression, Winston Smith raises his glass and toasts the past. Orwell was a man of the left who opposed communism. Churchill was a man of the right who opposed Nazism. Each rejected the notion that there were no enemies on their putative sides. Instead, they recognized that both totalitarianisms were kindred with each other. Churchill was a patriot, but one who declared that Britain fought by ourselves alone, but not for ourselves alone. We stand, the faithful guardians of the right and dearest hopes of a dozen states and nations now gripped and tormented in a base and cruel servitude. Contrast his words with those of Heinrich Himmler to the SS in 1943. We must be honest, decent, loyal, and comradely to members of our own blood and nobody else. Whether 10,000 Russian women fall down from exhaustion while digging an anti-tank ditch interests me only insofar as the anti-tank ditch for Germany is finished. Would you rather have a global order in the spirit of Churchill or Himmler? Strong gods versus false idols. The more sophisticated argument is not that the Nazis were unfairly maligned, but that the West overcorrected in response to their crimes. Thus we don't, in fact, have a Churchillian global order dedicated to the defense of civilization, but an omniliberalism built to ward off the specter of Nazism. That specter, in turn, has been used to suppress dissenting voices unfairly labeled fascist. N.S. Leon eloquently expresses this view, writing that Hitler provides the para-religious raison d'etre for the open society consensus and the whole post-war liberal order. To prevent the resurrection of the undead Führer, there's truth here, but it's an incomplete truth. The post-war order was created to oppose totalitarianism, which, after the defeat of Nazism, was primarily embodied by the Soviet Union. Thus, in 1959, President Dwight Eisenhower declared that NATO's goal was to protect the spiritual foundations of Western civilization against every kind of ruthless aggression. Leon claims that, for the post-war establishment, the meaningful bonds of faith, family, and above all the nation were now seen as suspect, as alarmingly retrograde temptations to fascism. But after World War II, faith, family, and the nation were seen as bulwarks against global communism. Totalitarianism opposes traditional values, which threaten the ruling party as much as it opposes the open society. Leon notes that the Cold War's end sent the open society consensus into overdrive. I agree that, having vanquished its last ideological rival, post-war liberalism fell into a reverie regarding the inevitable end of history, which encouraged hubristic overreach. The West's historical memory does tend to emphasize the evils of extreme particularism, as embodied by the Nazis, over the evils of extreme universalism, as embodied by communists. But the answer to anti-rightist one-sidedness isn't anti-leftist one-sidedness. It's to recognize that both extremes lead to the same outcome, in Orwell's anti-totalitarian words, a boot stamping on a human face forever. Likewise, the answer to the failings of the open society isn't a retreat to authoritarian leadership or totalizing ideology. Instead, it's to acknowledge, per Leszek Kolakowski, that no society, not even the open society, can do without trust in tradition to some degree. That's because complete liberation from tradition and the authority of history leads not to the open society, but at best to one in which conformity enforced by fear keeps strict control over the struggle of private interests. We do need what Leon, borrowing from R.R. Reno, calls the strong gods, strong beliefs in strong truth claims, strong moral codes, strong relational bonds, strong communal identities and connections to place and past. But we must not confuse brutality for strength and the demonic for the divine.